Shrabani Basu is a journalist who was born in Calcutta but has lived in the UK for more than 20 years. She's written 2 books that have evolved from her observations of the shared history of India and Britain. Her first book, Spy Princess, tells the story of Noor Inayat Khan, a young Indian woman who was dropped into occupied France to support the French resistance. And her second, Victoria and Abdul, documents the life of Abdul Karim, who became one of Queen Victoria's closest confidants and then had to endure the resentment and jealousy of others at court. Referring to Victoria and Abdul, the critic Philip Knightley said, "Every now and then, you come across a book that is so startling that it changes your view of the world. I found such a book this week." Please welcome Shrabani Basu. And then reading that introduction, I realized I'd forgotten all about the book on curry. 3 books, and again...
That was the first book, actually. Yeah.
That was the first book. And all of them talks about or deal with the shared history between England and India. So what draws you to those kinds of stories?
I think being a journalist, being based there, one is always looking for stories. So something exciting, something different. And the curry book evolved out of my love of journalism. And the first thing I noticed when I went to England in '87 is that there was a Spice of India, a sort of Balti house, and all these Indian restaurants in every corner. Even if you went to the remotest islands, you would find an Indian restaurant. Inevitably, it would not be run by an Indian. He would be from Bangladesh. Also, the food was not Indian at all. It was a strange mix which had been done for the palate. So that really intrigued me, and I said, I've got to write about this and see how it started. Started digging around, and that evolved into the first book, which was a work of pure journalism and a look at history. And of course, I found this character, Abdul Karim, in that book. So,
oh, you found him in the curry book?
I found him while I was researching curry, because I found that Queen Victoria loved her curries. And guess who cooked them for her?
Exactly. And we'll get to that story, because that's a great story out of that book. And then, so how did you find the story of Nora, the Spy Princess?
Noor was actually something that happened for the 50th anniversary of the Second World War. And I was following all these Indian veterans who have all served. One of the few things we don't know is that 2.5 million Indians volunteered for both the world wars. It was the single largest volunteer army in the world ever. And they died in far-off places, in Africa, in Italy, sort of sometimes unmarked graves. And I've always followed their stories. There were a few veterans left in London and around. The Gurkhas were there. So while doing the stories on them, I came across Noor Inayat Khan. And it was 5 lines about her in the Times, Murdoch owned. And it just said that she was a secret agent in the Second World War. She was killed in Dachau. And that's it. And I said, who was this woman? How did she get to the European theater of war? And she was intriguingly, she was a Muslim. What sort of family did she come from? How did she reach there? And I sort of filed her away, and I said, I'll get back to her someday.
Well, let's go into her story in just a second, but I wanted to ask a question about documents, because I think both books feature documents that surfaced many years after the incidents, of course, and you were lucky enough to get access to those documents. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sometimes you have to be lucky. So when it was 2003 that I decided to work on Noor Inayat Khan, I'd finished the curry book. And that is when the British government declassified all their wartime documents of the secret agents. So those files were opened for the first time. And that was a major source of information. And then, of course, I had to build the rest of the story, contact a family, contact others. It wasn't just the files. And then that's how it started.
And with Abdul?
Well, with Abdul, there was nothing that had just come out. I started, as usual, it was a blank plate. My editor said, you're not going to get anything. And I said, that's not what I ever accept. As a journalist, I will find something. So my first stop was Windsor Castle, where else? And I wanted to see Queen Victoria's journals. So I saw those. And then I asked to see her Hindustani journals, which are the journals she maintained with Abdul Karim. She learned Urdu, which is something very few people know. And those started me
rich,
off. And
yeah.
then, of course, the whole picture built up.
Okay, back to Noor. Can you describe her family and her upbringing?
Well, Noor was actually a descendant of Tipu Sultan. She was sort of 4 generations down. Her father was Hazrat Inayat Khan. He was a Sufi. He came to America. He met an American woman, Nora Baker. They fell in love. He got married. And then they moved back to London. But Noor was born in Moscow. So it's a very exotic upbringing,
Yeah.
you know, Indian Sufi father, American mother, born in Moscow, raised in London, and then Paris. So Paris is where she really grew up most of her years.
And even though the family was forced to leave Paris at the beginning of the Second World War, she really never lost. That was her home and her
Absolutely.
love.
She felt French, British, and Indian at the same time. She was very, very strongly Indian as well. She felt strongly about Indian independence, in fact. But she was so focused that she knew that in this war, I'm going to fight fascism. It's the greater evil. And after the war is over, I'm going to go back and fight for Indian independence.
And she probably would have fought for independence.
She would have. Her brother told me she would have. She was quite a spirited lady. So when the war broke out...
And that was a little bit of a concern within the Secret Service, you know, exactly how trustworthy was she and what were her motives.
Absolutely. They asked her straight out, would you support the Indian leaders who are in jail at this time, who are supporting the freedom struggle? And this is when the war broke out, all the Indian leaders, Gandhi, Nehru, they were all put in jail. They actually spent the entire period of the Second World War in jails. And Noor was very aware of this. She said very frankly, as I said, she told them, at this moment, my loyalties are with you.
But
and
after...
they were shocked. But somewhere, they liked her forthrightness. And she was taken in.
Tell the story of how she found her way into the Secret Service, because on the face of it, she's not the most likely candidate.
Absolutely no, she was an unlikely spy. Well, she was actually recruited. When she volunteered for the war effort, she was recruited as a radio operator. And this was the first batch of radio operators, because this is the most dangerous area in the field. They could be discovered, they would be caught, and she became one of the first women to be trained. And this organization called the Special Operations Executive, it was a secret organization started by Churchill himself. He said, and they started employing women, and they were looking out for people with language skills. So she knew French, obviously, she knew the area, she was a radio operator, fully trained. She was perfect for the job. So one day she got this letter inviting her, and she goes for this interview. She doesn't know what it's for. It's one small room, and the person interviewing her is speaking in French. So she doesn't know why. This is in the middle of England. She talks back in French, and then in less than a minute, he tells her, you're going to be recruited as a secret agent. You're going to be sent to Paris undercover. You will not be wearing a uniform, and if you're discovered, you're going to be shot because you don't have the protection of uniform, and will you take the job? And she said yes. And it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It was absolutely something that she believed in, something she could do. And it was apparently the shortest interview ever. She was recruited just like that.
And the man doing the interview said it was the most intense and clear expression of commitment to the job that he'd ever witnessed. He didn't doubt her for a second.
He didn't doubt it for a second. He said her eyes, you know, she was just sitting opposite me. He writes very beautifully and describes her and as a person.
She had a bit of a liability, like she didn't like to tell lies. So for a spy, that's sort of an important thing, you know, when they say, are you a spy? You don't kind of go, yeah, I am.
Absolutely. I mean, she was going there on a false passport. Her name was Jean-Marie Renier. She was going as a French nurse. But of course, once she was in the field, she was terrific. She was given her own special codes. She survived. As I said, these radio operators, they were falling like flies. The longest they survived was 6 weeks. And Noor Inayat Khan, this shy, gentle, harp-playing, she was a writer of children's stories, a totally unlikely spy. She lasted 3 months. And her whole circuit had collapsed. And she was the only one sort of hanging on their last post between London and Paris. And she was doing the work of 6 radio operators.
Can you talk about why that particular job was so complicated, so crucial, and so dangerous?
It was dangerous because the pictures are in the book, but this radio wireless set, they weren't really clever those days. They didn't have these little iPhones and iPads. They had a suitcase. And she had to carry this huge thing around with her, which means cycling or on the metro, and every place is covered, crawling with the Gestapo and informers. So she was right out there. In fact, they did. She was on the metro once, and these people came up and said, "Could you open this?" And she opens it. So she opens it a little bit, and she was obviously, she played along. She opened it a little bit and said, "Can't you see? It's a cinematographic apparatus. Look at all the light bulbs." And these 2 German soldiers, they don't know what a cinematographic apparatus is, and they were not going to admit it, of course. So they say, yes, okay, go. So she goes. And at one more incident, she had these radios came with these long aerials, sort of 16-meter long aerials that you had to hook up. So one day she was putting it up on a tree outside her house, outside her apartment. And suddenly there's this voice. He says, "Excuse me, mademoiselle." And she turns around. And it's an SS officer who lived in the apartment above her. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she just plays along, and she says, "I just wanted to listen to the wireless." Now, they weren't allowed to listen to certain stations, so she pretended she was breaking a small law. And he was like, his heart melted, this pretty young girl, and he said, "Oh, I'll help you put it up, madam." Which he does. He puts up this wireless for her, thinking, it's a small little illegality. And half an hour later, he has no idea that she's tapping away her Morse codes to London and filing away. So she survived. She used her friends' addresses.
She kept moving around all over Paris.
She changed her appearance. She dyed her hair red. She looked horrible. Her friend said, "Get rid of it." She did everything. She kept moving, kept her transmission short. But she was betrayed.
Because the Germans could actually hack in, and once they got in, if they broke any of the codes, then they knew everything that was going on.
Exactly. The way it worked, they were listening in, and they could hear the tap, tap, tap going out, and they would then start switching off the lights, cutting off the power in the area, so they would isolate the spot where the Morse code is going out from, and they would reach there within seconds. So you had to send your transmission, which means hang up this thing, type it out, send it out, and move as fast as you can. So this just kept them going, And she managed to do this. She would have survived and lived to tell the tale, but she was betrayed. So.
We'll go into that in a minute, but a few minutes ago you said that she kind of breezed through training, or she was from the beginning a good candidate. But there were some mixed feelings about whether she was suitable for this at all. There were people in the system who were saying, "Do not send this woman behind enemy lines."
Absolutely. Some thought that she was totally unsuitable because she was somebody who was so frail, so gentle, somebody who couldn't tell a lie. She was scared of weapons. I mean, she wasn't a crack shot, sort of Mata Hari type of a person. She was very different. And they doubted that she would survive a Gestapo interrogation or anything. But her superior, her bosses, they saw that behind all this, there was a sense of steel in her. She had this iron spirit, and they recognized that, and they sent her there.
How was she betrayed?
Well, it's the usual story. It was a triangle love story. Everybody was in love with Noor. She was so beautiful. So it was a story of jealousy. She was betrayed by a woman who was jealous of her, who loved somebody who loved Noor. So she sold her address for 100,000 francs, which was nothing in those days. So she gave the address to the Germans, and they entered her flat and arrested her.
And before the betrayal, her whole network, because they were kind of built into cells of people who were actually the operatives, and then she did the radio work. But it was beginning to collapse before that anyway. People were being picked off and arrested.
Yeah. It had collapsed. Within a week of her landing in Paris, her whole circuit had collapsed. And London told her to come back. But she told them that, "No, I'm the only one surviving here. I'm going to rebuild. I'm going to stay. Otherwise, there's no link between London and Paris." So she stayed on. She knew that she could be caught any time. And well, it did happen, but she did survive a long time. And she was working all alone with trying to build contacts with others and getting it. She did build up a circuit again, but...
Can you talk about the last few months, the imprisonment and eventual...
In prison? Oh, well, once she was... Well, as soon as she was arrested... Do you want me to read a bit about when she's arrested?
Sure.
That little bit? It just give you a little flavor of how... well, how she fought when she was arrested. I'll just... search... Okay, this is... she goes... The Germans have set this whole operation to catch her. And... okay, I'll read a bit. The house that Noor was staying at was at the Rue de la Fessandrie, a corner house which led off the Avenue Foch. The street was right opposite 84 Avenue Foch, headquarters of the Gestapo, who were distributed in small groups to watch her house. On the morning of 13 October, Noor came out of the main entrance and walked into the baker's shop, which was situated in the same building. Within minutes, she came out again and walked away. The German officers sent out to arrest her. Ruel and Hogg were sure the girl was Noor. She was wearing a blue tailored dress trimmed with white and a dark hat. It was the dress Viano had bought her a few days earlier. They started following her. Suddenly, Noor turned around and saw them. Instinctively, she knew she was being followed and quickly disappeared around a corner. They did not see her again, though they searched the area thoroughly. Once again, Noor's training had come in handy. She managed to shake off her followers and disappear. After a lengthy search, the Germans returned to the station. 2 hours later, they heard that Madeleine had been arrested. Madeleine was her code name. The man who made the arrest was Pierre Carteau, a French officer working for the Gestapo. After she had shaken off the German officers, Noor had at some time returned to her flat in Rue de la Fessandrie. She turned the key in her lock and went in. Standing behind the door was Pierre Carteau. He had let himself into the flat and was waiting for her. A violent struggle followed. Carteau seized Noor by her hands, but she fought back savagely and bit his wrists. As Carteau tried to free himself, Noor continued to struggle, bit him harder, drawing blood. Eventually, he was forced to release her hands. Carteau tried to push her on the sofa and handcuff her, but he could not subdue Noor, who was attacking him ferociously. Finally, he drew his gun from his pocket, told her to keep still or he would shoot. Then with one hand training the gun on her, he used his second hand to make a telephone call to Kiefer at Avenue Foch and asked for assistance. Kiefer immediately sent Ernst Vogt and told him to take 2 or 3 men with him. Vogt described the scene later. Pierre was standing, covering her from the farthest possible corner of the room, and Madeleine, sitting bolt upright on the couch, was clawing the air in her frustrated desire to get at him and looked exactly like a tigress. Noor's eyes were flashing with rage, and she unleashed a stream of insults on her captors, calling them sale boche, dirty Germans. Vogt said he had never seen such fury. Noor was also cursing her luck. She exclaimed that this would have to happen at the last moment, just before she was going to leave for England. Outnumbered by the Gestapo, she sank back on the couch. Carteau's wrists were bleeding heavily. Vogt and the other officers led Noor down the steps. Trying not to attract the attention of the other residents of the building, they bundled her into the waiting car for the short drive to 84 Avenue Foch. The Gestapo had finally caught up with Noor. At Avenue Foch, Kiefer was delighted with the news of her arrest. Ruel remembered thinking that she must have been a very important agent indeed. So they caught her in the end. And they took her, well, but she made an immediate escape attempt. The minute they took her, within a minute, she'd gone into her room and she climbed out of the window and tried to escape. Then they caught her, pulled her back, and then she made another escape attempt, this time planning with 2 others. And they managed to climb up on the roof of Avenue Foch, which is this big building, 4th floor. They climbed up on the roof. They would have escaped, but it was the time the RAF started bombing, so the air raid sirens all went off. They searched the rooms, they found 3 prisoners missing, found them on the roof, got them back, and Kiefer would have, they just shot them point blank. He did point to her, he would have shot her straight, but something about Noor, he couldn't pull that trigger. And then he just called up Germany, he called Berlin and said, she's too hot to handle, I can't keep her here in Paris, take her away. And Noor was taken to a German prison. So she was taken far away to Pforzheim prison in Germany and kept there in the most dreadful conditions. She was shackled. Both her arms were shackled, her feet were shackled, and there was a chain passing from her feet to her hands. So she couldn't move. She would have to hop like that. She couldn't clean herself. She couldn't feed herself. She was kept in complete isolation. 2 cells on either side, one on top, were all kept empty. She was sort of given her food when no one was there. And she was beaten every night. But she didn't give away any secrets.
She didn't break at all.
She didn't break. So that iron spirit that her bosses had recognized was there in Noor. She just hung on. She didn't give away anything.
And she showed that spirit. They sent her to Dachau, and she was executed there. How do we know that part of the story? I mean, you go into it in great detail.
It's because all the Germans gave their evidence afterwards. When they had the war crime tribunals, they interviewed them at length. So in fact, this description of her arrest is from one of the files. I've just written it out, but it's what Werner Ruhl, one of those who was sent there, he describes it. And we also have the testimony of all the the German who transported them to Dachau. He took 3 other SOE agents with him. The 4 of them traveled. Suddenly one fine day they were called out after 10 months, and she was told, "We're taking you to Dachau." They took the train to Munich, and on the way, they had no idea. Suddenly she met 2 other agents who'd been brought from other jails, and they could speak in English. So it felt like a picnic. They were given some cigarettes, they were given some sausages to eat, and this beautiful Bavarian countryside. They looked at the mountains. It was a few moments of happiness, actually, before the end. And then they were taken to Dachau, and there she was kept again, taken in isolation, brutally tortured all night, and finally executed, gun to her head. And she defied her captors right till the end.
Right,
she went down screaming "Liberté." So that was it.
She received many honors after the war, but you've been instrumental in having a statue to her erected. Can you talk about that?
Not yet erected.
But
We've got the permission. We've started. I campaigned a lot. I just felt Noor's story had been forgotten, while her other colleagues who have also, very brave other colleagues who've also been given the George Cross, which is the highest civilian honor, they had memorials and she didn't have anything. So I campaigned. And we finally got the permission, and now we are fundraising. So yes, if all of you want to contribute, do go on our website. And
how much money do you need?
Oh, we need £100,000. But every bit helps. It is. I mean, we are getting money from the US, so Canada and India. Every bit, every little bit helps.
It would be the first statue to a Muslim Indian woman.
It'll be the first statue to an Indian woman in Britain. It'll be the first statue to any Muslim in not just Britain, in Europe. So it'll be in Gordon Square, near the house where she lived and from where she left on her last mission. She used to sit in this park. It's a beautiful park. So if whenever you visit London, you will hopefully, fingers crossed, this will be up in a year or 2. You'll be able to see the statue. And it'll keep her memory alive. It's in the University of London area. Just like this, you have young students. It's so important that this story is remembered by the next generation, which is why I'm constantly giving talks in schools and universities. And I feel this memorial is important.
Well, you have discovered and delved into the lives of 2 of the most interesting characters you could probably get your hands on, and very different in a lot of ways, because Abdul, the main figure of the second book, was not entirely selfless, was he?
No, not in the least. Well, after Noor, it was such a deep and an intense book, as you can imagine. I needed something different, and everybody said, "What are you going to do?" And then I had filed away Abdul somewhere, and I said, "Okay, let's get him out." And, well, that was an entertaining story. So I had lots of fun writing it. It was hard work, but Abdul was definitely no saint. He was a 24-year-old. He was a clerk in Agra jail, and he was sent to Queen Victoria as a present.
Was he part of the first group of Indians to actually arrive at court?
He was In Queen Victoria, no, there were Indian travelers who'd come before.
Before.
But he was the first to actually be working in the court. So he was sent as a present for her golden jubilee.
You can read in a second.
In a second, yeah.
In a
I
second.
was just thinking,
But he started as a servant, but with a tremendous amount of self-confidence. You mentioned your curry book, and there's this wonderful scene where he's not there as a cook, but finds out that Queen Victoria has never tasted a curry, and he just starts hauling out the spices and making a curry.
Absolutely. He was a good, enterprising Indian. That's what he was. He knew a good thing when he saw it.
How to get to her.
He'd carried his spice box. I mean, that he would have to do, because as Muslims, they had to cook their own meals, you see. And Queen Victoria had really looked after them. There were 2 of them who were sent as servants. And because they had to have halal meat, they were allowed to keep chickens. So there were these chickens running around Windsor Castle because the Indians needed them. So he had his little spice box, and he decided to make her a curry. And she pronounced it excellent.
Did she have it every day?
She did. And then she ordered that a curry should be made in the royal household every day. So for 13 years, always at lunchtime, there would be a curry cooked in the royal kitchens.
And I don't think we're spoiling anything to say that after she died, the curries disappeared. There were no.
Well, her son sent away all the Indian servants, and Abdul didn't stay a servant for very long. He was promoted very rapidly. So within a year, he had been promoted to becoming her Munshi, or teacher, and her Indian secretary. So.
Well, and let's go back to the Urdu, because as well as the curry, he finds out very soon after his arrival at court that she doesn't speak any Urdu, but that she's interested, and he sits down and says, okay, let's start.
She was. Queen Victoria had never traveled to India. Now, she was the Empress of India, and she longed to find out. I mean, this was her jewel in the crown, and she'd never touched it. So when Abdul comes, all the reports she'd got were from the viceroys or from her son or whatever. It was, the upper India as they'd seen it. What Abdul did was, Abdul was India. He came to her, and he brought her the stories from the streets. He told her about, described the heat and dust of Agra, the festivals, the politics, and then she was so intrigued, she wanted to learn Urdu. So I'm going to read a little bit of the way Abdul Karim taught the Queen Urdu, because this is quite amusing. There was a little phrase book. These are from the Hindustani journals, which she maintained with him for 13 years. So initially, he gave her a little phrase book. It's in Windsor Castle, a little gold-lined red phrase book with a few words written in it. Everyday words like anyone, koi, animal, janwar, anger, khafa, to those of you who know a little bit of Hindi. Then there were phrases. So standard phrases like, you may go home if you like, tum ghar jao agar chahte ho. The tea is always bad at Osborne, poor lady. Chai Osborne mein hamesha kharab hai. There's worse. The egg is not boiled enough. Anda theek se ubla nahi hai. So can you imagine the Queen sitting there in Osborne and saying, Anda theek se ubla nahi hai? And then, very intriguingly, there's a line there, you will miss the Munshi very much. Tum Munshi ko bahut yaad karoge. And this has been dictated by the Munshi. And the most intriguing, hold me tight, humko mazboot thamo. We end there.
So how long did it, he started as a servant, but ended up, as you say, the scribe and the clerk. So how long did it take him to go rise in her view?
Rapidly. From his diaries, which actually I recently discovered in Karachi, and which have been updated in this book, I know he writes in that he was unhappy. He was an arrogant man. He was a clerk in Agra jail. He felt, this was menial job for him, waiting at tables. So he threw a tantrum within a month of his arriving and said, this is not for me, I'm going back. And the Queen actually begs him to stay on, saying, I like you so much, and do stay, I want to learn Urdu. So he's immediately elevated and becomes a Munshi.
And then she starts to give him preferments of various kinds. She starts to favor
absolutely.
him in...
He's ranked with the household. And let's not forget the household. They are the gentry, you know, with their morning coats and their total proper tops, top hats and all. And Abdul Karim is now allowed. He's given his houses. He's given a carriage. He's allowed to use the billiards room. So one turban among all those. Then he's given the best seats in the opera. If he's not in the royal box, he throws a tantrum. So he's always in the royal box. He sits there. There are plays they do in Osborne House, and he's given a role in them. So
yes.
he is rising rapidly. And of course, this causes enormous discontent and gossip
in fact,
and everything.
Almost everybody turns against him. The Indians who felt that he was getting things that he didn't necessarily deserve.
Exactly.
The rest of the court who...
Exactly.
So talk about how that began to bubble.
Absolutely. Within months, everybody realizes. Remember, 2 servants had come. One was the portly, smiling Muhammad Baksh, and the other was a 24-year-old, tall, handsome Abdul Karim. And the queen picked the young, tall, handsome Abdul Karim out of the 2. So it was very obvious that he was the chosen one, and they were obviously jealous. So the household is jealous because anything Karim wants, he gets. He's given land in Agra. 500 acres of land. He's given palaces. A house is built for him in Balmoral, and the queen calls it Karim Cottage. So it's still there in Balmoral if any of you visit. It's part of the royal estates, and it survives. So naturally, there is a huge anger and jealousy against him, and they try everything. They say he's a spy. Things don't change. He was a Muslim spy for the Amir of Afghanistan. He is leaking secrets. He is doing this, theft, name it. They sort of try to pin everything on him. But the queen just stands there and will not hear any of it. They even try to go on strike.
Yeah. And was that when she swept everything off of the table?
She used to take him on all her journeys to Europe and wherever. And the royal household say, no, we're going to go on strike because we have to sit in the same room and eat with him. And one of them is chosen to go give this news that we are going to go on strike to the queen. And the minute she hears this, she gets into a huge rage and she sweeps everything on her table on the floor. So papers, pens, memos, bottles, ink pots crashing to the floor. And this lady who'd given this message just goes howling from the thing, tells the rest of the household. So what of the strike? Nobody goes on strike. The royal party goes to Europe, and Abdul Karim is, of course, there with the queen.
And he doesn't help his cause because he begins to act like he's entitled to all of this stuff.
Absolutely.
And he pushes the queen around.
He does. He asks for more. As I said, he was a good enterprising Indian. He asks for more. By the time he's leaving, in 10 years, his chest is covered. He's also putting on weight, so he's keeping up with his queen, all the good living in the palaces. His chest is covered with medals. The CIE, he's given the Companion of the Indian Empire, he's given highest titles. Then he starts asking for the knighthood. He rather fancies himself being called Sir Abdul. And that's when the Prime Minister steps in and says, you can't do that because the only people the Indians given the knighthood are the royalty, like the Maharaja of Jodhpur or the Maharaja of Jaipur. And they would throw a fit if they had to come in and, rub shoulders with Abdul. So she accepts. He doesn't get the knighthood, but he is just one below it. He's CIE. He's nearly there. And, so everybody hates him. The Indian royalty hate him. The Indian servants hate him because, he was one of them who's gone up, so they hate him. The household hate him. There's very few people. There's the queen, and there's Abdul Karim, and they are in this bubble. And it's amazing because what I did was I would read her journals, and I would read the Urdu journals, and I would read her doctor kept very detailed journals, and I would read his journals on the same day when I knew there's a crisis in court. And the doctor's journals are full of 3 pages of angst.
You have to talk about him because this poor guy, everybody figured he was the one who could sit down and tell the queen all their complaints. So they all come to him and he goes in and has to sit down.
Exactly. So this is the doctor, Dr. Reed, James Reed. And he has these 3 pages of, oh my God, this is what's happening with the Munshi today. And I read the same day, I read the Queen's journal, and she says, the Munshi's wife has had kittens. We're going to go see the kittens today. Todd,
No.
it's a bubble. And you think, oh my God, is this all? Because she didn't, she said fiddlesticks to them, really, and just tossed them
And the
away.
doctor practically got sick from all of the strain and stress of being in between the complainers who weren't getting the action that they wanted, and the
Absolutely.
Queen who wouldn't do anything.
Absolutely. And he almost resigned too. But then the Queen really liked the doctor, so he stayed on. He was a very loyal Scotsman. He stayed on. But he gave the term Munshi mania. So he coined this term Munshi mania. And the Diamond Jubilee, now Karim had come for the Golden Jubilee. 10 years later, he is, of course, fatter and more decorated, wealthier, everything. And they call it the year of the Munshi because he has caused so much trouble in court. It's amazing. The whole world is there watching this elaborate Diamond Jubilee celebrations. This is the first British monarch to have a Diamond Jubilee. And it's the height of empire. Everyone is on display. All the kings of Europe, all the nobility from India.
And there's the Munshi.
In the palace, it's boiling over this man who is causing havoc in court.
What is your best guess, and I think in some ways it has to be a guess, about why the Queen was so enamored of him?
Well, many things. I think, first of all, she was a very lonely queen. She was very passionate. She had been in mourning ever since her husband had died.
She wore black from...
She wore black. The image we all have of Queen Victoria is black bonnet, black, lots of diamonds, lots of bling, but very, very black, just in mourning, constant mourning. After her husband died, she was brought out in isolation by, many of you may have seen this film called Mrs. Brown. It's about John Brown. He was a Scottish gillie. And that is a Scottish sort of somebody who looks after the horses and is a servant. And she got very, very close to him. So that caused a huge furore. So Abdul Karim, everyone started saying, oh, here we go. He's filling John Brown's shoes, actually. Now, John Brown dies, and the Queen is devastated again. She writes that she can't even stand, she can't walk, and she's in this lonely phase. And then 4 years later, along comes Abdul, dressed in his turban and his everything, all his finery, with all his stories.
Exotic.
And he just sweeps her away. She's swept into this Indian wonderland. And she lives her dream of being Empress of India. She's entertaining all the Indian kings who come to Osborne House. She builds a whole Indian room. It's called the Darbar Hall. The pictures are in the book. And it's done entirely like an Indian, with Indian carvings, Indian lattice work. It's like a mixture of Hindu-Muslim architecture. And this was her banqueting room. So she would sit here in all her finery, Indian servants standing behind her, greeting these nobility, talking to them in Urdu, and serving curries.
She was in her 70s. He was in his 20s. They were together for, I don't know how many years?
They were together 13 years.
13. Was there any ever rumors or suspicion about anything physical?
Well, she used to take him away to this remote cottage in the Scottish Highlands. It was called the Widow's Cottage. And so there was a lot of gossip. She used to go there with John Brown. And after John Brown's death, she had said she would not go there again, ever. And of course, how do we know all this? Because the household write about it. And it's this long-suffering doctor, he writes very sarcastically, that she has gone and taken Abdul with her. She's gone to Glasalsheel, and she had sworn she would not go there. So, but my own hunch is it was a very, very layered relationship. At one stage, she was mother to him. She writes, your loving mother, in letters. In other times, she writes, your loving friend, your closest friend.
And she gave him instructions on how he and his wife could better their chances of having a child. They were having trouble.
They were
and she gave him sex advice.
Exactly. I call it the Victorian manual. And it's so detailed. It's amazing that, this is Queen Victoria, who we think of as so prudish. And here she is completely frank. And she's writing to this servant from Agra. And she's close enough to discuss all this, very frankly with him.
Yeah.
He didn't have children. The manual didn't work. But, it is amazing. It's one of those few letters that survived. And, if there were more like this,
We'll get to the letters. So take us through the last few hours after she died.
Mm-hmm. Right. This was... Abdul Karim, as I've just said, everybody hated him, so he knew his days were numbered. When the Queen dies, it's just a few hours after her funeral, and there's a knock on his door, and he opens it, it's dawn, and standing outside is the new Queen, Princess Alexandra, the wife of Edward VII, Victoria's son, and she's standing there with Princess Beatrice, Victoria's daughter. And they ask for all the letters written by Abdul Karim to him, and they want them all. Now, the Queen used to write to him every day, 6 times a day, and she would write from everywhere, the royal yacht, cottages. When he went to India, she would write telegrams, everything. They took the whole lot, and they make a bonfire outside his house, and they burn them. And the whole family is watching. It's a very, very cruel scene, and all these dear Abdul, your loving mother, your loving friend, your closest friend, some with hearts, not hearts, the little X for kisses and stuff, they all just burn there. And he's then told to go back to India, deported.
But before that, he's actually the last person to see her.
Yeah. It happened by accident, but it just happened because the new king, he knew that his mother would have wanted Karim to come and see her body. So he allows him, but he says, you're going to come in last. But as it happens, he is actually then becomes the last person to see Queen Victoria and spend time alone with her before the coffin is closed. So, and she dies in Osborne House, in the place where she'd made a mini India. So it's all quite sad, really, by this time. It's quite significant. She writes that he will walk among the principal mourners behind her, so he does that.
But then banished. I mean, just as though he never existed.
Every letter is destroyed, and he is sent back home to Agra. And not just him, Hal, it's all the Indian servants, because by now Queen Victoria had a whole lot, quite a few Indian servants, and they were always causing so much color and chaos in the court. And all of them are sent back. So suddenly, one of the ladies in waiting, she writes that it's become a very cold place. All the color has gone. No more curries in the kitchen, no more of this madness, all these people running around doing crazy things. And it had become a very cold place.
So for the time, she was enlightened, and was the opposition, was the distaste for what she clearly enjoyed and reveled in, was it racism or class or both?
It was both. It was both. It was racism, of course. They used to call them the Black Brigade, and all sorts of things. And Queen Victoria actually wrote a memo saying the word black will not be used for these Indians. You will respect them. I think she would write pages and pages, a 34-page memo she gave her household, accusing them of racism. But of course, it wasn't just race, it was class. I mean, if he'd been a prince with a mandatory string of pearls, he'd be all right, but he was a clerk from Agra jail, and that wasn't on for them. So it was a mix of both, really.
And after he's back in India, there's a rumor, somebody in court says, there are more letters.
Yeah.
And they send...
And he's, Edward VII, her son, is absolutely paranoid about that there may still be more letters. And it's not surprising he was, because one of the letters, actually, is quite interesting. It says, it's a letter by the Queen to Edward, in which he's she lists that you will be courteous to the Munshi. You will do this, this, this for the Munshi. And it's a reply by Edward saying, I will be courteous to the Munshi. As if he's a schoolboy, he literally says all this. And then what does the Queen do? She makes a copy of this letter, Edward's letter, and sends it to the Munshi. So both of them are just having a laugh at, so this is how close they were. So one of these letters was found when the Munshi dies, 9 years later. I always felt, he just died heartbroken because he was a young man. He was just 44. He was not ill, nothing. It wasn't the same for him after being thrown out. And, I say it was Frodo. When he comes back to the Shires, he's been to Middle Earth, and it's not the same. So he just dies heartbroken. And once he dies, Edward VII sends another letter to the Viceroy saying, there may be more letters. So then they come and knock on his house in Agra, a house in mourning, and they take out more letters, postcards. By now it's literally signed Christmas cards, and they take them away again. So this happens twice.
And the family said, please, can we have 3 back?
Yeah, the widow's begs and pleads for some, and she says, these are my mementos, can I keep them? And he says, only for his lifetime, for her lifetime, and makes the nephew swear on the Quran that after the widow dies, these letters will be sent back to Buckingham Palace.
Were they?
As if anyone cared. I don't think so. I think by then India, the independence, things had changed in India. By now the independence struggle is going on. The Viceroy was uncomfortable with the raids. He writes to the king saying this is not right.
This is going to cause trouble.
Yes, this is going to, because the Karims were a well-known family, a well-known Muslim family in Agra, and you are subjecting them to this. So, and the political climate in India had changed. The independence struggle was on. So everything was moving rapidly. Who cared about these letters then?
I'm going to give you guys a chance to ask questions because these are incredible books and fascinating figures. But just before we open it up and we'll give people a chance to think for a second, have you found another amazing story?
There are so many, but I don't know if I'm going to do the same again. I'll start getting a reputation. I might do something different. I don't know. It's all open.
It's all open. Yes, you've got to get the statue done now.
Yeah, that is a priority. So at least for the next year, I am so busy. I've never done this sort of thing, you can imagine. So fundraising is another ball game altogether.
Is there a design for There's a design?
We have a very good sculptor. She's done busts of other SOE women. So there's one of Violette Szabo, who was another SOE heroine, and that is on the South Bank. And that was unveiled in 2009. And that's when I felt, Violette Szabo, Noor Inayat Khan, they were the 2 women who were killed. They were both given the George Cross. Why is it never Noor? And I really, really went out to campaign and got MPs and lobbied with the House of Lords and members of Parliament, and finally we got the permission. So.
Okay.